We've answered how the tree of life started to be structured, right? How different organisms were grouped together based on traits and named based on their shared traits. Now we're going to answer how we structure the tree of life in terms of knowing what organism evolved to what organism evolved to what organism, right? What are our ancestors, what are descendants? Now, this is something that we just recently figured out, and we're still figuring out, but just recently figured out in the last few hundred years. During the early 1800s, the French naturalist Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck recognized that lines of descent from older fossils to more recent ones, right, there seemed to be a pattern of fossils slowly changing their forms, the way they lived, where they lived, eventually becoming new species. But there was that slow progression over time of some sort of evolution. And he didn't know how to explain what was happening because back then they didn't know what evolution was, right? So he assumed, mistakenly, but he assumed evolution occurred because of some sort of inner want, right? The organism really, really wanted to change. So it was able to change and cause its offspring to change. So for example, the giraffes developed really long necks because they wanted really long necks. Right? They wanted to be able to eat the high leaves off of the high trees, and just that inner desire allowed them to grow their necks and lengths. Now, we have since figured out this is not correct. As much as I think about it, I can't grow any taller. I'm as tall as I am now. Okay? But we did figure out how this was able to happen, right? How did giraffes grow longer and longer necks? Well, it was through natural selection. This was figured out by Charles Darwin, who gets all of the credit, but also Alfred Wallace, who did a lot of the work and doesn't get a lot of the credit. They jointly proposed the hypothesis of natural selection, right? This is what drove evolution. So they concluded that many more organisms are born than can survive into reproductive adults, right? That's why dogs have 10 puppies per litter. It's because, probably not all of those puppies are going to survive to adulthood and be able to reproduce. So there have to be more babies born than will make it to adulthood. Right? This means that there's going to be some variation in the offspring, right? Not all puppies look the same. Not all puppies are the same weight, the same height, the same energy. And because of those variations, the characteristics that help that animal survive are going to be passed on to the next generation. Whereas the characteristics that don't help the animals survive, those animals are going to be the ones to die before they can reproduce, and those traits are not going to be passed down to the next generation, right? So natural selection, survival of the fittest, it's really survival of the best traits at that particular time, right? But that can change as the world changes. So evolution through natural selection is now a scientific theory. And this is a word I do want to talk about because I think a lot of people who aren't in science don't realize how confident scientists are in their theories. Theories aren't just something that, they're not hypotheses, right? They're beyond hypotheses. Hypotheses are what we think could be the answer. Theories are hypotheses that have been tested over and over and over again and proven correctly over and over and over again, right? So evolution through natural selection is a scientific theory, just like gravity is a scientific theory, just like the sun being at the center of the solar system is a scientific theory, right? They are pretty much known facts. They've been tested over and over again and proven correct. Okay, so Darwin and Wallace figured out evolution through natural selection, but they didn't know what caused the variability, right? Why don't all puppies look the same? Why do siblings look different? This was figured out by Gregor Mendel. He did those famous experiments on peas where he, bred peas together and looked at their offspring and how they were similar or different to the parents. And he found out that it all came down to genes. Right, so the parents have specific genes that they can pass down to their offspring, and there is a likelihood of each offspring getting some combination of the parents' genes, which means that each offspring, each child gets a different combination and looks a little different, has different characteristics. right? So this explains a lot of the variation among the offspring, but it doesn't explain how we could evolve so drastically, right? If all of evolution was just driven on by natural variability due to genes, right, it would be very, very difficult for over time a dinosaur to evolve into a bird, right? That would be too drastic of a change. Where those drastic changes come from are from mutations, right? It's when the genes have something wrong, isn't quite the right word because sometimes it works out for the better, but where the genes, something goes wonky when the genes are created and passed down, creating a new variation that did not exist before. Right? So mutations can be caused naturally, and they can occur spontaneously without any sort of specific causative agent. So for example, a lamb could be born with a fifth leg. Okay. Now that would be an example of a mutation that would not be passed down to the next generation because that mutation is not within a sex cell. So that the mutation is not going to be passed down to the offspring because the mutation is not within a sex cell. If the mutation happens to occur within a sex cell, then that can be passed down to the new generation. For example, the reason we can drink milk, right, is because of a mutation that happened 10 to 12,000 years ago within a sex cell that was passed down from generation to generation. This is also why a lot of white Americans are not lactose intolerant, but other people from around the world are more likely to be lactose intolerant, right? Because it's in our genes being passed down from generation to generation within groups of people. All right, so we've talked about these genes from the parents being passed down to the offspring, which if you take a step back and think about this rather than on an individual scale, on more of a community scale, we get the idea of populations and gene pools. So a population is a group of individuals of the same species that all occupy the same area. You can think of basically all of the organisms that could be having sex with each other, right? And all of those organisms that could be reproducing with each other, they're the same species, they live in the same area. All of their genes together is the gene pool. Those are all of the genes that could possibly be passed down to the next generation from that population. Okay. Now this gene pool, every single year is given to the new offspring, which means that gene pool is going to change with every generation, right? Natural selection is going to come into play, mutations are going to come into play, and over time that gene pool is going to evolve. This can happen very quickly if some population becomes separated from the other population. This could be geographic separation or something like that. And this would rapidly create a new species. So for example, think about a population of frogs. They live in a pond and they're all able to interbreed together and their gene pool is passed down. Say that pond begins to dry up and becomes two smaller ponds. And so the population that used to be one population is now separated between the two ponds and those populations no longer interbreed with each other. Now their gene pools are going to change in different ways because they're isolated from each other. They can start to diverge from each other. And those two different groups of frogs, if given enough time and enough generations, can actually become two different species that can no longer interbreed because they're so different after so many generations. This often happens on islands. So for example, Darwin's finches, the finches on each of the different islands were separated from each other. So they began to speciate, become different species based on the environment in which they were in. Some of those finches needed to be able to eat really hard seeds if the island they were on had that type of food. Some finches needed to be able to pick insects out of the wood, right? So as they lived on different islands, they had different needs, different factors driving that natural selection. Their gene pools were separated. And so many different species evolved based on the environment that they were in. And we call that adaptive radiation, right? Basically, the species were adapting, radiating out into the different environments they were in.